Hey, what's up? It's Paul from Guitar World, and this man over here needs no introduction. It's John Petrucci.
What's up, Paul?
How you doing?
Doing well.
The man behind Dream Theater, and today we're going to be doing John's 5 favorite riffs off his brand new album, Distance Over Time. Now, not only will this be, as John so aptly put, a lesson within a discussion, what's even greater is we're going to be talking about really the creative thought process behind these riffs, or if you will, as you also said, the inception for these riffs. So let's start with the first single off the album, Untethered Angel, and then we'll talk about it.
All right, sounds good.
Great. So John, I'm looking at the way you play that riff. It's absolutely an intricate riff. Tell me how you construct a riff like that.
Well, first of all, we should probably let people know before they try this on their guitar that's tuned to standard tuning.
Yes.
The guitar is tuned down to C.
Yes.
So the whole guitar is tuned down 2 steps.
Right.
All right. So that means the low open 6th string is now going to be a C.
Right.
And not an E.
So let me stop you there really quick.
Yeah.
When you create a riff like that, and as I said, it's very intricate, when you're playing it, how do you decide whether you are going to use that, say, like one of your guitars that are in standard tuning, or you say, man, I need to use it in drop C? Is it just a matter of just you hear the riff in a lower register?
Well, I'll give you a very specific example about this song. So that riff, a version of that riff originally came in as a John Mayung riff idea. And he was playing it on, I think, his high G string or D string. Somewhere. I think it might have been the D string. And it just had a different kind of sound. On the bass guitar up that high, it doesn't really sound like a heavy riff. It almost just sounds like a line.
Right.
And so when I heard him play, I was like, John, just bear with me for a second. Let me grab one of my other guitars. Now, when we recorded Distance Over Time, my guitar tech, Matty, you should have seen this. It was beautiful. He had like every tuning lined up and labeled
on each guitar.
So it's kind of like, well, let me see what this would sound like with a B flat baritone. Which was, I know I'm spoiled, but it was really, really cool to have.
Sure.
So in this case, in speaking to John, I said, you know what, I could hear that as more of like a heavy riff rather than like an up high line. So let me just try this, and I grabbed the C tuned guitar and cranked up the boogie and played it, and it was like everyone kind of looked at us like, all right, this is the way to go.
So something like that's immediate. You hear it and it's like, that's the key.
You kind of like picture it in your head, and again, to me, that's sort of like weaving riff that he was playing. I heard it as like a heavier thing, as opposed to like on the bass, it almost it almost has like that like Tool vibe. It's a different feel.
Plus, you're also accessing the open string elements of it, which really, that's a big point.
That's a huge point, which I want to... So that's part of the inception thing.
Right.
So a couple of things about this, just technique and theory-wise. If Van Halen taught us anything, it's that we can use open strings to create arpeggios that would otherwise be more difficult.
Also create the idea of motion, or like just something that's going faster than it actually is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if something is easy and it sounds cool, those are the 2 criteria that you just
Plus how it feels under your fingers.
Exactly.
The tactile response, in which you can clearly see that's what you're constantly. It's a constant motion.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So so in this case, like the reason I use the Van Halen thing, I mean, you can make arpeggios happen just by outlining the notes of a chord on a single string. So in this case, we're tuned down to C, right? So I can play, the opening of this is C minor. So I can play a C minor arpeggio just by doing that. And you have the octave up here, right? And that's the whole like
Got it.
thing, right? So just by moving those notes around, you can create different sounding arpeggios based on the chord progression. You know, C minor, there, C major. And the other part of that is that's an example where the root is in the bass. But let's say you wanted to create an arpeggio on the 5th position chord here. This, with the tuning, would be an F minor. So F, A flat, C. So that C, which is the 5th, you can actually put on the bottom. So now we're implying an F minor chord. All right?
Right.
So very, easily we have these 3 chords here: C minor, F minor, and then C major. There you're kind of implying almost like a C7.
Got that.
Right, so you see what's happening just by kind of molding your fingers to the different chord tones. You're changing the chord progression.
Right.
The other cool thing about the open string, besides it giving us access to notes we wouldn't normally be able to hit, is that you have this pedal tone thing going.
Yep.
And I love that. It's one of my favorite compositional tools. So what that's going to do is, with all those chords going by, even if you just play them over a simple pedal, like... That pedal note is causing a lot of tension.
Yes.
And it's making it sound darker and more dramatic.
Yeah. But you almost, by what you're doing with that movement, you actually hear those chord changes.
Yes.
It's implied, which is really nice, with what you're doing. But also you're adding a little bit of, ferocity to what you're doing.
Exactly.
So it's that's a really neat thing.
Yeah.
Now, do you feel that, like, now that you've shown the chord structure behind the actual riff, do you sometimes play with the idea of, like, okay, I got the main riff. Do I need to put an underlying chord structure underneath that, or is the riff enough?
Well, it's actually a compositional technique that we'll do in the band, where maybe on one of the appearances of this part, everybody will just be playing the single notes, right? So even Jordan on the keyboard, he's playing the actual line. So that means that the chord progression is up for interpretation. And what I mean by that is, like, even in the example I just showed, from C minor to F minor to C major, and then I said C7 over here, right? But you can that could also be a B flat minor if there was, like, that chord being played over it.
Right.
So what we'll do is that when it makes another appearance, we'll take advantage of having a keyboard player, and he will start to do a chord movement over the top of it. That's when it gets really interesting.
Wow.
Because then you could reharmonize what we're doing. The line might not change, but the harmony is changing. And I think that's a really, really cool technique. It helps to build the song.
So does the theory come first as you're constructing it, or after you sort of get it all together, you're like, oh, that's what it is. Let's have fun with the theory part of it.
I think it comes after, for the most part, because it's mostly like when you're writing, we try to do things like by instinct and based on melody and based on how it feels and how it sounds to everybody, without getting caught up too much in the theory part.
That's what that's what I feel when I watch, as I'm watching it. It's like, wow, they just really went for it there, and then I feel that all that other stuff that you said just sort of comes after. You're like, wow, this is kind of cool. Here's what we can do post.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really neat, and it just shows in just the whole construction of the song. The real question is, where do you stop with the riff? Right.
Yeah. Well, it is a question, and it's a funny thing, but it's almost like you just know when it's right. You know when the part should be over.
That's cool.
And that's part of being in a band and having this kind of synergy. And it's fun. And sometimes you differ in opinion as to that should go longer or shorter. But for the most part, you get to a point where everybody's really digging.
The other thing I was going to ask you, and I think we talked a little bit about before, is like, at one point, constructing a riff like this, how much of it goes into, like, oh man, there's so much to it,
Right.
until it becomes muscle memory.
Yeah.
And then of course the other unfortunate aspect is going back to your band members like, okay, this is what it is. And,
Right.
and then they look at you and groan.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, there's a couple things. I mean, technique-wise, as far as muscle memory, with a part like this, now it's not going by very fast.
Right.
So there are certainly a lot more complicated things to play.
Sure.
But whether you're playing something like this or something more complex, there's what I would say is called like a tracking thing that you need to do, where you're kind of making certain decisions as far as fingerings.
Right.
And then with your eyes, you're targeting where your hand should be at a certain point, usually at transitional points.
Right.
So that's part of the memory, but it starts from like having to track. So in going from like the F minor and then up to, could be a B flat minor, and then back, there's a little passing note. Now you have to kind of make a decision, what finger am I going to play that passing note
Sure.
with? You know, in this case I decided if I use my pinky and, you know, for that note, it'll sort of set me up for the next
Right.
section.
Plus you're doing a little bit of a slide off of it.
Right. So right now there might be an easier way where you're already in position, so you can use a second finger and then sort of hop over your entire hand, get to the next part. But that's how you'd practice something like that. You decide on the fingering, you use your eyes to track where your hand has to be, and then you kind of do those small movements and break them down to where, like, when it happens, your hands just automatically
Right.
know what to do. So either with the pinky or the second. But you have to make those decisions, and that's what helps get that muscle memory going.
And plus I noticed, and how does the right hand factor in? I noticed that you're alternate picking that
Yeah.
as well. Is that's also important as opposed to just straight flat picking
I
it?
think so. I mean, it depends on the tempo of the song. There's a couple of different things you can do with this type of riff. Certainly, you could do all down strokes if you want to have that Metallica approach, but
Sure.
I don't know if there's a benefit because there's no palm muting going on. So it would just be like a lot of like wasted energy. And it also, the pick attack is different.
Sure.
It almost like, I don't know, it makes the
Sounds forced.
It sounds forced and a little bit too bouncy.
I find it very educational in the sense that, you know, here you are playing it in one way, and then and it's automatic
Yeah.
how the first way that's the way you got to do it.
Right.
It just sounds more fluid.
It does. Well, what makes sense with this particular riff is that it's being, you know, it's almost like a long group of 8 chord notes. That's the way I sort of think it. If you count out the whole riff, it's sort of repeating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, new 2, 3, 4. So it's 2 measures of 4, or it's an 8. It's like a chunk of 8, and within that 8, if the tempo is like this, then those are 8th notes. And this is a very typical grouping, but it's 4 groups of 3. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3,
Right.
1, 2, 3, and then 1 group of 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the 4 groups of 3 make 12, and you add 4, and that's 16, and that's an even number. So my longer point is, if you're just playing alternate picking, since it's eventually an even grouping, it'll always end up on a down
I see.
stroke. right?
That's
So
great.
It's like down, down. So there's no real need to change that
Right.
right hand.
No, it just said there it is. It just makes sense at that
Yeah.
point. Yeah, that's amazing. And then now, as I said before, you're trying to teach that to your other band members, or
Yeah. Oh, I forgot about
That's
that.
the-
Yeah. Depending on if you're teaching like a extended chord progression or a complicated riff, I mean, there's a learning process, and everybody has their different way. When I personally get into the writing environment, I've developed my memory to the point where my long-term memory is pretty bad. But my short-term memory when writing, if somebody shows me a riff or I'm learning something, or if I came up with an idea and I finally honed in on the thing I want, I could remember it really, really well. And then sort of show the other guys. Or if they're showing me something, I could retain it really well. But that's not the same for everybody. Like Jordan writes everything down. So if I'm showing, let's say I wrote this and I'm showing it to him,
sure.
then he would just write it down and then play it.
Right.
You know, John would have his own way of doing it. I might record it for him and be like, okay, John, learn this. And, you know, it's a stringed instrument. You can certainly sit there
Sure.
and learn from each other. It just takes a while because it's like, okay, that was the first part. Here's the second part. Wait, what was that first part again?
Right.
And I'm sure every band goes through that. But as long as you develop some sort of process to do that,
Right.
then you're good. You know, ultimately you want to get everybody on the same page playing the right notes.
That's it.
That's the end result you're looking for.
Yeah, amen to that.
Cool.
Great.
All right, there you have it.